Before we begin, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This is the verbatim federal courtroom testimony from the Sean Diddy Combs trial as reported by Inner City Press. What? Unexpected evidence silenced the entire courtroom today and prompted the judge to immediately clear the gallery. Why did 3 jurors visibly react with tears as the audio recording played through the federal courtroom speakers? And what did Kim Porter, Diddy's former partner and mother of his children, reveal in her final days that could potentially alter the entire trajectory of this high-profile case in a federal courtroom where Sean Diddy Combs faces serious accusations? The prosecution introduced what they described as critical evidence directly relevant to the defendant's state of mind and pattern of behavior. This evidences series of audio recordings allegedly made by Kim Porter in the weeks before her unexpected death in November 2018. Sent shockwaves through the proceedings and visibly disturbed even seasoned court personnel. The moment the first recording began playing, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. Diddy, who had maintained a composed demeanor throughout much of the trial, suddenly straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from confidence to apparent shock. His attorneys immediately requested a sidebar conference, which the judge denied as the recording continued to play. This wasn't merely another piece of evidence. It was the voice of a woman who had shared nearly 13 years of her life with Diddy, who had borne 4 children with him and who had, according to the prosecution, documented her concerns and observations in the final weeks of her life. Voice, clear, and deliberate on the recordings detailed specific incidents, conversations, and concerns that aligned precisely with allegations central to the prosecution's case. I'm making this recording because I need to protect myself and my children. Porter's voice stated in the opening seconds of the audio, what I've witnessed and what I know can't stay hidden anymore. What makes these recordings particularly significant isn't just their content, but their timing. Created just weeks before Porter's death from pneumonia at age 47. Death that some have questioned these audio files appear to have been Porter's attempt to create a record of information she felt was important to preserve. This isn't simply another witness testimony or second-hand account. If authenticated, these recordings represent the direct observations of someone who had intimate access to Diddy's private life and business operations for more than a decade. The implications extend far beyond the current charges and potentially open new avenues of investigation. If you find this information valuable, please take a moment to like and subscribe. This helps us continue bringing you the latest developments in this explosive case as they unfold. The Manhattan Federal Courthouse had settled into the rhythm of a high-profile trial entering its 3rd week. Security procedures had become routine, media positions established, and the gallery filled with the now familiar mix of journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who had secured seats through the daily lottery system. When Assistant U.S. Attorney Alina Michaels approached the evidence table that morning, there was no indication that the day's proceedings would dramatically alter the course of the trial. She carried a standard evidence binder, her demeanor professional and measured as it had been throughout the proceedings. Your Honor, the United States would like to introduce Exhibit 47A through 47D into evidence, Michaels stated, her voice betraying none of the impact the evidence would soon have. The judge, who had reviewed the evidence during pre-trial proceedings, nodded solemnly. Proceed, Diddy's lead defense attorney, James Barton, rose immediately. Your Honor, we renew our objection to the admission of these recordings based on authentication concerns and prejudicial impact. The judge's response was measured, but firm. Counsel, we've addressed these objections in chambers. The prosecution has provided sufficient foundation for admission and the court has determined that the probative value outweighs potential prejudice. The objection is overruled. A technical specialist wheeled a small audio system into position near the witness stand, though no witness was currently testifying. The courtroom fell silent as Michaels explained the context of what the jury was about to hear. The following recordings were recovered from a cloud storage account registered to Kimberly Porter, discovered during digital forensic investigation based on metadata and content references. These recordings were created between October 21 and November 5, 2018. Ms. Porter passed away on November 15, 2018. The gallery, which had been relatively animated during the morning session, grew completely still. Even the usual subtle movements, the shifting of reporters taking notes, attorneys whispering to assistants, ceased entirely as the first recording began to play. The voice that filled the courtroom wasn't theatrical or dramatic. It was measured, deliberate, and unmistakably determined, the voice of a woman creating a record with clear purpose. This is Kim Porter. It's October 21st, 2018. I'm making this recording because I need to protect myself and my children. What I've witnessed and what I know can't stay hidden anymore. Porter's voice wasn't that of a casual observer or disgruntled exartner. It was the voice of someone who had made a difficult decision after careful consideration. And as the recording continued, it became clear that she wasn't speaking on impulse, but documenting specific incidents. Dates, names, and patterns that she had observed over years of close proximity to Diddy's personal and professional life. The courtroom wasn't prepared for the detailed account that began to unfold, the systematic description of events that aligned precisely with allegations from other witnesses who had previously testified. As Porter's voice continued, 3 jurors visibly reacted, one wiping tears, another covering her mouth in apparent shock. Because what Kim Porter revealed in these recordings wasn't just corroboration of existing allegations, was the contextual framework that connected previously isolated incidents into a pattern that suddenly appeared undeniable. The relationship between Kim Porter and Sean Diddy Combs spanned more than a decade, beginning in the 1990s and continuing intermittently until 2007. Even after their romantic relationship ended, they maintained a close connection as co-parents to their 4 children. Quincy Porter's son from a previous relationship, whom Diddy helped raise, Christian, and twins Delilah and Jesse. I met Sean when I was working as a model in New York, Porter's voice explained in the second recording. It was 1994. I was captivated by his ambition, his energy, his vision for the future. What began as admiration turned into love, then into family, and eventually into something much more complicated. Porter described the evolution of their relationship from romantic partners to co-parents and how this transition actually increased her access to certain aspects of Diddy's life. After we separated in 2007, Sean maintained a family residence where I lived with our children. He would visit regularly, host gatherings there, sometimes conduct business. I was no longer his partner, but I was still within his inner circle in ways that gave me a unique perspective. The judge observed attentively, as Porter's recorded voice described, how her concerns began to develop gradually over years of observations. It wasn't one incident that alarmed me. It was the pattern that emerged over time. The late-night phone calls about situations that needed handling, the young artists who would visit our home full of excitement about career opportunities, then later appear withdrawn or stop coming altogether. The business associates who seem to operate on instructions that were never explicitly stated but understood. Porter described her growing awareness of what she termed the system, a network of employees, associates, and enablers who facilitated various aspects of Diddy's personal and professional life while maintaining strict compartmentalization. There were people who handled transportation, people who managed properties, people who controlled access to Sean, people who dealt with problems these teams rarely intersected, and most knew only their specific function. But from my position as the mother of his children, as someone who had unrestricted access to our shared residences, as someone who was no longer viewed as an outsider, I could see connections that others couldn't. Porter's voice took on a more serious tone as she described specific incidents that had troubled her deeply. She detailed observing young female artists in states of distress after private meetings about their careers. She recounted overhearing phone conversations about handling individuals who had become complicated. She described noticing patterns in how certain business deals were secured shortly after private gatherings at properties she had access to. By 2016, I couldn't ignore what I was seeing. Porter stated, I began discussing my concerns with Sean directly. Initially, he dismissed them as misunderstandings or attributed them to the complex nature of the entertainment industry. Later, his responses became more defensive, then eventually threatening. Porter described a pivotal conversation in early 2017 that fundamentally changed her understanding of her situation. Sean came to the house late one night, clearly agitated about a situation involving a female artist who had made certain allegations. When I asked questions, he turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "You know too much about, too many things to be asking these questions, Kim. Remember everything I've done for you and the kids. Remember who owns this house you're living in." Porter's voice wavered slightly for the first time. That's when I realized my knowledge wasn't just a consonant was leverage. But it was leverage that worked both ways. What I knew could potentially protect me, but it also made me vulnerable. She detailed how she began documenting her observations more systematically from that point forward, noting dates, locations, individuals present, and concerning behaviors in a journal she kept secured away from their shared residence. "I wasn't gathering evidence to use against Sean," Porter explained. "I was creating protection for myself and my children. I needed to ensure that if anything happened to me, there would be a record of what I had observed and why it concerned me." What emerged from Porter's recordings wasn't a series of random grievances or the bitter accusations of an exartner. It was a methodical documentation of patterns observed by someone with intimate access to Diddy's inner circle over many years. Patterns that aligned with and contextualized allegations now central to the federal case against him. "I never wanted to be in this position," Porter's voice stated firmly. "But I have 4 children who deserve a mother who stood for truth, even when that truth is difficult and dangerous to acknowledge. I've stayed silent for years," Porter's voice stated in the third recording dated October 29, 2018. "I've prioritized co-parenting and stability for our children. I've accepted financial support and maintained the public narrative of an amicable relationship, but recent events have made it impossible for me to continue this approach in good conscience." Her voice took on a more urgent quality. "What I am about to detail isn't speculation or rumor. These are events I witnessed personally or learned about directly from those involved." Porter told the courtroom through her recording that the concerning patterns she had observed centered around 3 main categories of activity: the recruitment and exploitation of young artists, particularly women; the systematic documentation of compromising situations for leverage in business negotiations, and the use of intimidation and financial control to ensure silence. The pattern typically begins at industry events, showcases, open mics, even social media. Porter explained. "Shauna has staff specifically assigned to identify talented individuals who also appear to have vulnerabilities, financial problems, family issues, immigration concerns, anything that creates pressure points and dependency." She described how these individuals would be invited to exclusive gatherings framed as career opportunities where they would be introduced to established artists and industry executives. What these young people don't realize is that they're being evaluated not just for talent, but for those who seem most vulnerable to influence are invited to more private settings, typically the Miami residence or specific areas of the Los Angeles property that are equipped with recording devices. Porter then detailed something that caused audible reactions in the courtroom, specific locations, and methods of surveillance within properties she had access to. The Miami house has recording systems in 5 specific areas: the main living room, the pool area, the primary guest suite, the studio space, and what Sean calls the negotiation room. These aren't standard security cameras. They're designed to be invisible to guests, and they capture both video and audio. She explained that she had discovered these systems accidentally in 2015 when renovations were being done at the property, and she observed the security team reinstalling equipment. When I asked about the unusual cameras, Sean initially dismissed it as standard security. But later, after an incident involving a producer who suddenly agreed to unfavorable terms after a weekend at the property, Sean made a comment that clarified their actual purpose. He said, "Everyone's more reasonable when they remember Miami." It wasn't until I connected those 2 things that I understood what was happening. Porter then described what she termed the documentation system, a secure server that stored selected recordings categorized by individual names and potential utility. "I observed Sean and his chief of security reviewing this material on several occasions. They specifically focused on segments showing individuals in compromising situations. Intoxicated, engaging in illegal activity, making statements that could damage their public image. These segments would be edited into short clips that could be easily accessed and utilized when needed. Porter detailed how she had witnessed the deployment of this material during business negotiations, though often indirectly. Sean rarely shows these recordings explicitly. Instead, he would make references in conversations, mentioning specific details that the individual wouldn't expect him to know, describing the outfit they wore at a private gathering or alluding to statements they made when they thought, no one was recording. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Porter explained how this system extended beyond business leverage to ensure silence about potentially criminal activities. There were incidents involving women at these properties that deeply concerned young artists who appeared disoriented, who later claimed they couldn't remember parts of the evening, who demonstrated behavior consistent with being drugged. When I raised these concerns, I was told they had overindulged or couldn't handle their substances, but the pattern was too consistent, the circumstances too similar. Porter then revealed what appeared to be her most significant concern: her growing awareness of her own vulnerability within this system in early 2018. I began to suspect that my own conversations and activities were being monitored. Small comments Sean would make about private phone calls I'd had. His awareness of visitors to the family residence when he wasn't present. His references to conversations I'd had with our children when he wasn't there. It created a growing certainty that I was also under surveillance. She described how this realization prompted her to begin creating these audio recordings away from any properties connected to Diddy using equipment she purchased specifically for this purpose. I'm making these recordings on devices that have never connected to home Wi-Fi networks or been brought into residences that Sean has access to. I store them on a cloud account created with an email address he's unaware of. These precautions may seem extreme. The final segment of this recording contained what prosecutors described as the most directly relevant evidence to current charges. Porter's specific observations regarding individuals who have since come forward as alleged victims in the case. Between 2015 and 2018, I personally observed 7 instances where young female artists left Sean's properties in states of significant distress. In 3 of these cases, the women later contacted me directly, describing experiences that included being drugged, recorded without consent, and pressured into sexual situations with Sean or associates he designated. In each case, these women were subsequently offered career opportunities, financial arrangements, or management deals that effectively brought them under Sean's professional control. Porter named these individuals names that matched those of prosecution witnesses who had already testified or were scheduled to appear. The alignment of these independent accounts created a devastating corroboration that visibly impacted everyone in the courtroom. I recognize that documenting this puts me at significant risk, Porter concluded this segment. But remaining silent makes me complicit in a system that continues to damage vulnerable people. If anything happens to me, this record exists, too. Established that these concerns were real, documented, and reported. The prosecution paused the recording at this point as several jurors appeared visibly distressed. The judge called for a 15-minute recess to allow the jury to compose themselves before continuing with the remainder of the evidence. When court resumed, the 4th recording began playing. Dated November 2, 2018, just 13 days before Porter's death, her voice sounded more urgent than in previous recordings. Since making my previous recordings, I've observed concerning changes in Sean's behavior toward me, Porter stated. After I questioned the circumstances surrounding an incident involving a backup dancer who left a gathering in distress, Sean's attitude shifted noticeably. His visits to see the children became less frequent, but more controlled. He began insisting that I inform his security team before leaving the family residence with our children. He questioned my recent communications with people outside his immediate circle. Porter detailed how she recognized these behaviors as part of the control, the system she had observed being applied to others who raised concerns. The pattern typically begins with isolation, Porter explained, limiting the individual's contact with people outside the approved circle. Then financial pressure, subtle reminders of dependency. Then surveillance grading awareness that privacy no longer exists. Finally, direct threats usually veiled as expressions of concern. Porter described how she had begun experiencing these stages in sequence. 2 weeks ago, Sean questioned why I had lunch with a journalist who has written critically about the industry. Last week, he mentioned that our children's trust arrangements might need reviewing given some of my recent choices. 3 days ago, he made a comment about a private phone conversation I'd had with my sister that he couldn't have known about without some form of monitoring. Yesterday, he said something that chilled me. "I worry about your health, Kim. You haven't seemed well lately." Porter paused in the recording, her breathing audible as she composed herself. "I want to be clear that I don't know if these are threats or coincidences. What I do know is that they follow exactly the pattern I've observed with others who began asking uncomfortable questions." She detailed specific examples of this pattern being applied to others in Diddy's circle: employees who raised concerns about activities they'd witnessed, artists who questioned contract terms, even business partners who pushed back against certain demands. There's a systematic approach to neutralizing perceived threats. Porter stated, "It begins with identification, recognizing when someone has become what Sean calls a variable, then isolation, removing their support systems. Finally, resolution, either bringing them back into compliance through leverage or removing them from the equation entirely." Porter explained that this system created perfect control through fear and financial dependency. Most people eventually align with expectations because the alternatives seem worse. Those with children, financial obligations, or career aspirations tied to Sean's influence are particularly vulnerable. "I recognize that I'm in this category myself, which makes these recordings all the more necessary as protection." Porter described how her concerns had intensified recently due to specific incidents involving her children. Last month, our son Christian mentioned that Sean had begun preparing him for the family business. Through private conversations I wasn't part of, when I asked Christian about these discussions, he became uncharacteristically evasive. When I raised this with Sean, he accused me of interfering with his relationship with his son and reminded me that certain financial arrangements for Christian's future were still being finalized. She detailed how these interactions had crystallized her understanding of her situation. "I realized that my children could potentially be used as leverage against me, that my concerns about their welfare could be positioned as interference, that financial support for their future could be contingent on my continued cooperation and silence." Porter explained that this realization had prompted her to take additional protective measures. "I've secured copies of all important documents related to our children. I've established independent financial resources they can access regardless of decisions Sean might make about support. I've documented my concerns with my attorney with instructions about what to do if anything happens to me." The courtroom absorbed her words in tense silence as Porter articulated what appeared to be a growing fear for her safety. "I don't know if these precautions are excessive. I hope they are. But I've witnessed what happens to people who underestimate the response to perceived threats to this system. And as the mother of Sean's children with access to information accumulated over decades, I represent a significant potential liability." Porter's voice on the fifth recording, dated November 5, 2018, days before her death, conveyed a new level of urgency. "Yesterday, I found evidence that my private office at the family residence had been searched," Porter stated. "Items were slightly repositioned, documents rearranged. My journal, which I normally keep in a locked drawer, had been moved. The lock wasn't damaged, suggesting someone had a key." She described how this discovery confirmed her suspicions about surveillance and prompted her to accelerate her safety planning. "I've moved important documents to a secure location outside any property connected to Sean. I've established communication protocols with trusted individuals who will act if they don't hear from me at designated intervals. I've prepared instructions for my sister regarding the children's care. If anything prevents me from caring for them myself." Porter detailed how a conversation with Diddy that same evening had intensified her concerns. "Sean came to the house unexpectedly last night. His manner was different, overly solicitous, asking detailed questions about my recent activities and communications. He specifically asked if I'd been documenting our family life in any way, framing it as interest in preserving memories for the children. When I asked what prompted this question, he mentioned that an associate had suggested I might be keeping records of some kind. She described how the conversation had shifted to her health in a way she found disturbing. Sean expressed concern about my cough, which I've had for about a week. He insisted it sounded serious and offered to have his personal physician visit the house. When I declined, saying I'd already scheduled an appointment with my regular doctor, he became unusually insistent. He left what he described as special herbal supplements that he claimed would help, instructing me to take them immediately. I pretended to do so, but disposed of them after he left. I cannot verify that these supplements were unsafe, but the timing and insistence troubled me deeply. Porter explained that this interaction had prompted her decision to relocate temporarily, making arrangements to stay with my sister for the next few weeks, bringing the children with me. I've told Sean this is related to renovations at the family residence, which is partially truth. There is minor work scheduled. His response to this plan will be telling. She detailed specific concerns about her respiratory symptoms, which had begun shortly after an event at one of Diddy's properties. I developed this cough after attending a gathering at the Los Angeles house 2 weeks ago. It began as minor irritation, but has persisted and worsened. While this could certainly be a normal seasonal illness, the timing relative to my increased documentation and questions concerns me. I've scheduled comprehensive medical testing for tomorrow. Porter then addressed what appeared to be her contingency planning in case her health deteriorated. If my condition worsens significantly, I've instructed my sister to ensure independent medical evaluation, including toxicology screening. I've also prepared a sealed statement detailing my recent concerns and observations to be delivered to specific authorities if anything happens to me. Her voice became more determined as she continued, I want to be absolutely clear, I am not suffering from any chronic health conditions. I do not use recreational drugs. I have no history of respiratory illness beyond normal seasonal concerns. If anything happens to me, particularly anything that compromises my ability to care for my children, it should be thoroughly investigated. Porter then returned to the primary purpose of her recordings. These audio files, along with my written documentation, provide context for the activities I've observed over many years. They established that I recognized potential risks and took reasonable precautions. Most importantly, they create a record that cannot be easily dismissed if my concerns about systematic misconduct are ever investigated. She concluded this segment with what would prove to be her final recorded statement. I don't know if making these recordings puts me at greater risk or provides some measure of protection. What I do know is that remaining silent is no longer an option I can live with. Whatever happens next, there now exists a record of what I witnessed, what I knew, and what caused me concern. The truth matters for me, for my children, and for others who have been impacted by this system. The courtroom remained completely silent as the recording ended. The timestamp indicated it was created just 10 days before Porter was found unresponsive in her home, later determined to have died from pneumonia. After the recordings concluded, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michaels addressed the court regarding their significance. Your Honor, the government has introduced these recordings not to suggest alternative charges regarding Ms. Porter's death, which was officially determined to be due to natural causes, but to establish the defendant's pattern of behavior toward individuals he perceived as threats to his reputation and operations. Michaels directed the court's attention to specific segments that aligned with testimony from previous witnesses. Ms. Porter's descriptions of surveillance systems at specific properties have been independently corroborated by former security personnel. Her accounts of how compromising recordings were organized and utilized align precisely with testimony from the defendant's former technology consultant. Her documentation of specific incidents involving alleged victims matches their independent accounts in both timeline and detail. The prosecutor then addressed what appeared to be the most legally significant aspect of the recordings. Most importantly, these recordings establish the defendant's awareness of and direct involvement in the systematic identification, exploitation, and silencing of individuals, the very pattern of conduct central to current charges. Ms. Porter's position as a long-term intimate partner and co-parent gave her unique access and perspective that no other witness can provide. At this point, the defense attorney rose to cross-examine, though there was no witness physically present. Your Honor, while we maintain our objection to the admission of these recordings, we request the opportunity to address their content and highlight significant concerns about their reliability and context. The judge nodded. You may proceed, counsel. But be advised that the jury has been instructed on how to evaluate this evidence. Barton, Diddy's attorney, approached the podium. The recordings you've heard present a one-sided narrative from an individual who, by her own admission, felt her financial support might be in jeopardy. Ms. Porter expresses concerns, but provides no concrete evidence of criminal activity. She describes observations and impressions without substantiating the sinister interpretations she applies to them, he continued. Furthermore, these recordings were made just weeks before Ms. Porter's tragic death from pneumonia period when, according to her own statements, she was experiencing respiratory symptoms that could have affected her physical and mental state. Medical records indicate she had declined treatment initially, potentially allowing her condition to affect her perception and judgment. Barton emphasized the contextual background. It's also essential to consider that Ms. Porter and Mr. Combs had a complex relationship spanning decades, including periods of separation and reconciliation. Personal relationships of this duration and complexity inevitably include conflicts that can color perceptions and motivations. The defense attorney then addressed specific allegations in the recordings. Ms. Porter's descriptions of surveillance systems grossly mischaracterized standard security measures implemented at properties that frequently hosted high-profile individuals and valuable assets. Her interpretations of business negotiations reflect a limited understanding of industry practices, and her concerns about her own safety, while genuinely felt, appear to have been influenced by her deteriorating health rather than actual threats. Barton concluded by questioning the admissibility of the evidence itself. Finally, we must acknowledge the obvious. Ms. Porter is not available for cross-examination. The prosecution has introduced recordings that cannot be challenged through standard adversarial questioning. The defense cannot explore inconsistencies, clarify ambiguities, or test the reliability of these statements. This fundamentally compromises Mr. Combs' Sixth Amendment right to confront witnesses against him. The prosecution's rebuttal was brief, but pointed. The defense attempts to dismiss Ms. Porter's testimony as the product of financial concern or illness, yet cannot explain why her detailed accounts align precisely with evidence from numerous other sources. These recordings aren't standing alone. They're part of a comprehensive body of evidence that collectively establishes a clear pattern of behavior spanning decades. The prosecutor directed attention to the timing of the recordings. As for the proximity to Ms. Porter's death, the defense suggests this timing undermines her reliability. We would suggest it enhances it. These were the actions of a woman who recognized she might not have the opportunity to testify directly. A woman creating a record because she understood the significance of what she had witnessed. Michaels concluded with a direct challenge to the defense's characterization. Ms. Porter was not confused, vindictive, or unreliable. She was methodical, specific, and consistent. Most importantly, her accounts have been independently corroborated by witnesses and evidence with no connection to her. The truth of her testimony is established not just by her words, but by how precisely they align with the broader pattern this court has seen established throughout these proceedings. As the legal arguments concluded, the courtroom remained tense with the weight of what had been revealed. The voice of a woman speaking from beyond death had provided context and connection that transformed how the entire case would be understood moving forward. When the audio evidence concluded and legal arguments finished, the judge called for an extended recess. The atmosphere in the courtroom remained heavy with the impact of Porter's testimony from beyond the grave. Jurors filed out silently, several visibly affected by what they had heard. Legal teams gathered their materials with uncharacteristic solemnity. Diddy, captured by courtroom cameras, sat conferring intensely with his defense team. The confident demeanor he had maintained throughout much of the trial appeared significantly diminished. His legal team's urgent whispers and concerned expressions suggested they were grappling with the substantial impact of Porter's recordings. Outside the courthouse, the public response was immediate and overwhelming. News of the recordings spread rapidly across media platforms, with legal analysts describing them as potentially case-defining evidence. Reporters stationed outside the courthouse described the atmosphere inside in terms usually reserved for a landmark historical testimony. The courtroom essentially stopped breathing. One legal correspondent reported, "You could physically feel the impact of hearing Porter's voice describing these events, knowing she recorded them just days before her death. It created a gravity that transcended typical evidence presentation." Behind closed doors, the implications extended far beyond the current case. Within hours, sources reported that investigators had reopened inquiries into Porter's 2018 death. While her death had been attributed to pneumonia, the timing and content of her recordings raised questions that officials now deemed worthy of re-examination. The recordings also triggered broader investigations into the surveillance systems Porter had described. Technology specialists from federal agencies were reportedly analyzing equipment at properties mentioned in her testimony, seeking to corroborate her descriptions of recording capabilities and data storage methods. Perhaps most significantly, Porter's detailed accounts of how leverage was created and utilized prompted several high-profile entertainment and business figures to contact investigators through their attorneys. These individuals, previously hesitant to become involved, reportedly came forward after hearing descriptions that aligned with their own experiences. The entertainment industry's response revealed the impact of Porter's testimony. Studios and production companies with ties to Diddy announced comprehensive reviews of their relationships. Artists scheduled to release projects through his companies issued statements about reconsidering current arrangements. Investment partners initiated financial audits of joint ventures. Social media platforms became forums for intense discussion about Porter's legacy. The hashtags #KimKnew and #KimSpeaking trended globally as users shared clips of her with her children. Her modeling work and her public appearances with Dino, viewed through the profoundly altered lens of her testimony of both Porter and Diddy, began sharing their own observations that aligned with her accounts. Stylists, personal assistants, and event planners came forward with stories that, while individually might have seemed insignificant, collectively reinforced the patterns Porter had described. The legal implications for the case were substantial. Prosecutors filed motions to introduce additional evidence that previously might have seemed tangential, but now connected directly to systems Porter had described. Defense attorneys submitted urgent requests for continuance to prepare responses to this significant evolution in the prosecution's approach for the jury. The impact was perhaps most profound. Court observers noted their changed demeanor when proceedings resumed, more focused, more solemn, more attentive to connections between witnesses. The abstract legal charges had been transformed through Porter's voice into a human story with real victims, systematic methods, and long-term consequences. As one legal analyst observed, what makes Porter's testimony uniquely powerful is that she wasn't an alleged victim or a disgruntled employee. She was the mother of his children, a woman who shared his life for years and had every reason to maintain the status quo. Her decision to create these recordings, knowing the potential risks, gives her account a credibility that's nearly impossible to dismiss. For Porter herself, the recordings represented a final act of agency and protection, ensuring that her observations and concerns would be heard even if she could no longer voice them directly. In creating this evidence, she had transformed from potential victim to powerful witness. Her voice reaching the courtroom, she would never physically enter. The day following the presentation of Porter's recordings, attendance at the courthouse reached unprecedented levels. People began lining up before dawn to secure seats in the gallery. Many brought flowers and photos of Porter, creating an impromptu memorial on the courthouse steps. Her voice, finally heard in full, had created a turning point, not just in the legal proceedings, but in how her own story would be understood. This case continues to develop with new investigations launching daily. If you found this report informative, please like and subscribe for continuing coverage of this unprecedented case that's shaking the foundations of the entertainment industry. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light and hold power accountable.